All right. My name is Kevin Crum. I'm actually the HBCU LRI Subcommittee lead, and I share this role with my best friend here, Tori Clark. Today we have Mr. Darren Heitner. He's actually the expert in NIL. I don't know if everybody knows, but the past few weeks, he's been on TV stations, YouTube, and I actually discovered him maybe almost 6 months ago through Twitter, and I actually had the chance to meet him in person at the University of Miami's Law School Sports Conference. So we're going to jump right into it because we'll be cautious, Mr. Darren, time today. The first question I have for you, Mr. Darren, is, NIL is very big with Power 5 schools, and a lot of Power 5 schools are, they're actually building, like, they're not building, but they subcontracting the NIL portion out to third parties to help their student athletes find NIL deals. HBCUs and limited resource institutions, they don't have the revenue or the resources to do that. Do you think if there are any ways, or do you know any ways how HBCU student athletes can take advantage of NIL and can compete with Power 5s?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure to meet you in person, and I'm glad that we're developing our relationship further. To your point, first of all, just to clarify one thing. The universities, whether they're Power 5 or not, they're not subcontracting these types of opportunities or roles or obligations to third parties like collectives. In fact, what we've seen thus far in 11 months are boosters of those universities, people who traditionally benefit and support those universities, oftentimes coming together to create these collectives, pool their resources, and then provide offers to athletes in exchange for them performing certain deliverables. So I just want to make that clarification, and it's an important one because that means everyone is basically on the same playing field to start. Because an HBCU may have a much smaller budget than a Power 5 school, that does not prevent the normal gap from being bridged, which is a very nice thing. So how do you get an HBCU to now take advantage of this situation? And I think the clearest path is really through alumni, either individually or joining together and pooling their resources in a similar capacity as we're seeing across the country at Power 5 schools, and then realizing there's strength and power in numbers. There's a strength from a perception standpoint. I think a lot of people want to cover HBCUs actually gaining a lot of power in this way. We've seen some early examples already from a school like Jackson State, where obviously it's benefited by having a superstar like Deion Sanders as head coach. But that doesn't prevent any other HBCU from following a similar path and basically saying, we're open for business. An athlete at a Power 5 school has the same exact opportunities as an athlete at an HBCU. All that it takes is a brand or a booster to decide we want to dedicate our resources toward athletes at HBCUs. And a perfect example of that is a brand like Gatorade, which I've had the opportunity of working closely with. Gatorade has only associated itself with, I think at this point, 2, soon to be 3 college athletes from an NIL perspective, one of which is an HBCU player. And so I do think brands are going to realize there is a real benefit to associating with HBCU athletes, and that HBCU athletes, just like athletes at Power 5 universities, deserve to benefit from their NIL.
Thank you, Darren, for clarification. Another argument that I actually recently had in my sports law class here at the University of Miami, and it's NIL and Title IX. I know a lot of people are concerned that women might not have the same opportunities as men's sports. I actually mentioned that I think South Carolina, one of South Carolina women's basketball player has the highest, if I stand correct, have the highest NIL deal as of today. But what do you think? What do you see NIL and Title IX and NCAA moving forward?
It actually goes back to your first point and the clarification that I provided. I think schools have been and should continue to be very wise in not directly involving themselves in the transactions. Because once the school involves itself and perhaps picks and chooses which athletes are a good fit for brands and third parties, that's when Title IX becomes a big issue. There cannot be preference made by a university or an athletic department toward a specific type of athlete, whether we're talking about race, sex, etc. And so I think, again, it would be wise for these schools to keep a hands-off approach there and allow the marketplace to make the determination for itself as to which athletes it wishes to associate with. Again, the key with regard to the state passing laws on this subject, and also the NCAA putting forth its NIL policy, is really to create a situation where there's equality of opportunity. Not necessarily equality in terms of the amount of money that's provided to each athlete, because again, let the marketplace sort that out for itself. And that's where, again, I think that schools would be wise to take that hands-off approach so that they don't run into the Title IX quagmire that you introduced.
Thank you. At this point, open up to questions for anybody else. We have Mr. Tillman. He's actually our president, our lead of the Subcommittee at Florida State University. So open the floor to him and to Ms. Torrey.
Hey, y'all, I'm jumping in quick. I have a recruit here in a little bit, but I definitely wanted to jump on just to be with you all and listen in. Darren, we appreciate you taking your time out to educate us and just let us know about the important things happening within the world of NIL. It's constantly changing and shifting. So Tori and Kevin, appreciate your leadership. I'm sure we'll get some more people as we come on in as well too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tori, you have any questions?
None at this stage, no.
I think for me, just the smaller question would just to be as far as you know, NIL is really just for, students to, use their name, image, and likeness, yes. But if there were student athletes that are actually looking for opportunities, where would you see there would be not necessarily the most amount of money, but the easiest way to get opportunities? What would you say?
Well, there's, as I mentioned earlier, there's nothing that prohibits an HBCU from saying we're open for business. And the same is true for an athlete. I think the easiest way, and not to say that it's easy in any respect, but the easiest path would be for an athlete to develop his or her social media personality at an early stage, build that brand as early as possible without necessarily reaching out and saying, I want to do some sort of deals, or I'm thirsty for money, as opposed to actually building a community, building a following, and having that type of engagement. That's a great place to start. And then again, also, the athlete can easily say, I'm open for business, and proactively reach out to brands or even perhaps boosters of the universities and indicate their willingness and interest in doing these types of deals. Outside of that, there are marketplaces that have developed, things like influencer, open doors, icon source, market price. I can go on and on, but there are resources out there that will describe the various opportunities. And these marketplaces that already have a lot of brands onboarded, so the athletes can create their own profiles and also proactively reach out to these third parties and see if there are good fits there. I'm a big fan of quality over quantity, but at the same time, not every athlete is going to command the 5, 6, 7-figure deals. Maybe even 3, 4 figures can make a big difference in one's life. Just make sure that the brand, the products and services actually serve as a good fit. It's always awkward when an athlete is promoting some sort of brand that he or she has never even heard of before, never used. So try to get your hands on the product if it's a good, try to test out the service if it's a service-based business, and make sure that it's something you feel comfortable representing and promoting.
Thank you. Most of the practitioners are part of N4A. They even deal with academics with student athletes, or they deal with development with student athletes. And I don't know if you remember this question I asked actually in the sports conference at University of Miami is, NIL deals have time constraints that you must show up for certain situations, or, but with academics, that student athlete may during the semester may have to do more study hall, or you may have a test, a study hall test. how do you see NIL affecting student athletes with the academics piece of it, for its time constraints, or even just, are there incentives for having higher grades in academics?
Yeah, my overall hope is that athletes are still maintaining their priorities, which are academics and athletics. You know, a large part of the process for third parties when they're deciding whether to associate with an athlete is the athlete actually talented at his or her trade? But beyond that, academics too. Not every brand is going to care, but I have seen various brands indicate that they only want to associate with individuals who maybe have above a certain GPA or are showing a sincere interest in their scholastic activity. And even brands that have decided, while the NCAA restricts pay for play, so it does not allow for bonuses based on an athlete actually performing to a certain level, it does not restrict bonuses for academic achievement. And I have talked to some brands that are very interested in incentivizing athletes who are excelling in the classroom. And I love that.
Glad you made that clarified. The pay for play not being paid, that makes a lot of sense. That's why we got you on. Is there anything else that you just want to share on your own that you feel like, you know, us as practitioners among with HBCUs and limited resource institutions that we can do to, you know, help our student athletes attain NILs, or just attain them and then also keep them also?
Well, that's an interesting point, because it's not just capturing the opportunity, it's also retaining and building off of it. And that goes back to something I said before, which is authenticity is really important, and associating with brands that you have an appreciation for, that you actually like the goods and services they provide, is not only important so that the deal itself there goes well, it's also important so that you're not turning off your followers and those that you're engaging with, which commonly provide you a better basis for finding these opportunities. But other brands, other third parties are going to be looking at your portfolio. And if an existing relationship went off tremendously, that'll increase your opportunities down the road. Alternatively, if it was a failure and very transparently was not authentic, that can hurt your future opportunities. I think, you know, a lot of athletes are somewhat shy, and they shouldn't be when it comes to this. They're not shy on the field, they're not shy on the court. But when it comes to now going out and essentially creating a business, there's some trepidation from time to time. So I think, you know, studying, reading branding books, reading marketing books, becoming astute at those specific areas, figuring out how you're different from somebody else. What's your story? What makes you unique? Why should a brand associate with you? And using that as a pitch, and not being afraid to reach out to third parties. That would be sort of my mix of what I would suggest to athletes. And again, that's irrespective of whether or not they're at a Power 5 or an HBCU. But if we're going to be realistic, there will be brands that are overlooking HBCU schools and athletes who are looking primarily at Power 5. And so it may be on those schools, the HBCU schools, and the athletes at those universities to be a bit more proactive and explain to those brands why they're special, why they have compelling stories, and the value that they can add.
I really love the fact that you said that student athletes need to build their brand on social media. You know, we often find a debate about, you know, how social media can be, you know, negative for us, like mental health, but at the same time can be positive too. You know, especially if you build your brand right. You know, if I show I'm an academic student, I'm a higher achiever, I can show my grades, show my achievements, show my community service. Like you said, you know, a lot of organizations or companies will come towards you for NIL deals. Once again, I want to open it up for everybody else to ask questions. Mrs. Renee Edwards or Mr. Nathan Bennett, feel free to ask questions. At this time, I got to open it up for everybody. Anyone got any questions?
I mean, if not now and something comes to mind, as you know, Kevin, I try to be as accessible as possible, and you can find me on social media. Otherwise, ask your questions then. There's no such thing as a bad question. I know it's sort of a cliche, but especially in an area like this, it's brand new. There's not many people who are following it on a day-to-day basis. And I don't know the answer to everything, but I do my best. And I'm happy to answer whatever questions come out.
Yeah, hey, sorry, I'm kind of jumped on late trying to put out a few fires here for you, but did have some, I guess, some curiosity, I guess, within NLI space and, you know, the guidelines that the NCAA just kind of put out here on Monday. They are just, I guess, that guidelines. And even after, you know, that was put out, we see that Davis up at Detroit Mercy came out with a big NLI deal there. And I've seen where sports agents are saying, hey, I'm just waiting for, you know, maybe an NCAA to put down the hammer on one of them to sue. Do you think that it's going to be the case here down the road, and where the guidelines, you know, are they really going to be taken seriously, you know, by the membership and those individuals that are doing it?
It's a good question. You know, I wouldn't even characterize it as guidelines, because really the guidelines came out July 1 of last year. All that we got this week is some further guidance, which tells us a collectivism is a group of boosters, which I think most people understood, and that you're not supposed to be using NIL to induce athletes to enroll at specific universities. I think, interestingly, in addition to that, in the guidance, it also talked about not using NIL to keep athletes at universities. Although, in reality, how is the NCAA ever going to prove that there was a deal to keep an athlete there? Where I think the NCAA is very concerned is with regard to deals being offered to high school athletes and also athletes who are now entering into the transfer portal. It does not want NIL to play a role in causing an athlete to go to a specific university with regard to that specifically. I don't think the NCAA comes out this week with such a strong position and Gene Smith saying, we know that lawsuits will be coming, unless it actually had put in some thought as to who it wants to make an example of. And so I do believe the NCAA will be compelled to take some sort of action. I don't think it's going to be broad-based. I think it is going to pick and choose its battles, probably 1 to 2 boosters and 1 to 2 collectives to start. And as it's said in its guidance, prior to May 9, it's only going to enforce its rules against the most severe and egregious violations. So I think most boosters and collectives probably exhaled at that point and said, okay, we're going to be okay. Going forward, it will be interesting whether or not the NCAA does what I think it will do again, which is only go after a select few that have basically voluntarily put a target on their backs. I think we can all come to our own conclusions as to who that may be. And then realize, especially with a weakened enforcement staff, it can't go after every single potential violation. It just can't. As far as membership's concerned, I mean, look, as you know, the NCAA only exists and only has power to the extent that its member schools give it to the NCAA and allow for it. So there obviously is an interest among, I'd say, the majority of schools to do something. That said, I mean, I even know there are many schools and individuals at those schools who believe there should not be any action taken and that the NCAA has outlived its purpose. It's a really interesting time to be involved at a university. I think there's going to be so much change over the next 6 to 12 months. And we're all in a wait and see pattern. I don't know what the NCAA will do. I hate to speculate because whenever I think the NCAA will zig, it zigs. So.
Yeah, especially when you look at the Lamborghini endorsement down in Texas. So.
It brought back in the Alston case, which came down about a year ago. I remember there was a justice, it may have been Kavanaugh, who talked about a quote unquote no Lamborghini rule because it came up in and Alston was about academic educational related restrictions. And there was a concern, I guess, by the NCAA that potentially a school could give a Lamborghini to a player. And And the justice said something along the lines of, well, that's not going to happen. There's a no Lamborghini rule. And then I'm thinking a year later now, and you see not academic related benefit, but NIL, a player getting a Lamborghini down in Texas, and God bless him. I mean, I personally, I'm fine with that, but it's interesting how far we've come in a short amount of time, especially given that I'd say maybe the first 6 months, you didn't see a lot of this heavy activity, whereas now we're seeing multi-million-dollar deals.
Like you said earlier, NIL can be a deal of the deal of you're enrolled to a school, but if I'm a college coach, I can talk about my previous NIL deals with my other student athletes, right? And that can be
That's
very
cool.
intriguing for a student athlete, right? Because you can say, hey, look, one of my former student athletes, he just signed $1 million deal with so-and-so. So
Sure.
that's a recruiting tool too, right?
Yeah, look, nothing prevented on the recruiting trail a coach saying to a player, hey, this booster gave $12 million to the university last year, or we put in X amount of dollars into our athletic facilities last year, or our coach is getting paid, we hired the best coach in the country getting paid $10 million per year, or we've had a certain level of success. We had 10 wins last year, 12 wins last year. I mean, these are incentives to an athlete. It goes into the athlete's decision-making process. And just like those examples, now coaches will, on the recruiting path, say, yeah, our running back got a Lambo last year. Not to say you're going to get a Lambo, but this is what happened. And that may be persuasive to an athlete to enroll.
Mr. Tillman has a question also. He said, what are your thoughts on standardizing NIL education within athletic departments?
Well, I don't know that I love the idea or concept of standardizing education. I like giving universities the capacity to create their own curriculum. Sorry, my dog's acting up. But what I like about Florida's law in particular is that it includes a requirement. Give me 1 second. It includes a requirement that before the first and third years of enrollment, athletes must receive a certain amount of financial literacy and life skills workshops. I think it shouldn't take a state law to require it or for a school to be enticed to provide that type of education. I think, honestly, courses like that, information like that, practical information should be provided to individuals at an earlier stage of their life. I think back to when I was in high school, maybe even middle school to start, but why didn't we learn these types of things like basic tax planning, basic managing of our finances, basic terms that we should be looking for in contracts? And you don't have to be a lawyer, you don't have to be a financial planner or an accountant to have an appreciation for these things. We're just not taught that early enough. I do put it on the universities, but I also think that high schools, middle schools across the country should be doing a better job of this, as opposed to teaching us what I think is a lot of information that is not practical and that we'll never use in our lives. So to answer again the question, I think it's important to provide that information. I just don't necessarily think it needs to be standardized.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
We have 5 more minutes before we end. Any more questions from anyone else? If not, Mr. Heitner, I just want to appreciate you stopping by. You didn't have to. I know you had a busy schedule, and I know you're very busy, but on behalf of N4A and at the Concern Committee and the N4A, and HBCU Subcommittee, we're really grateful that you stopped by today.
I appreciate you asking me to. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. All right. Stop recording.